Yesterday, the entire country woke up to the threat of a Chinese communist spy balloon floating above the skies of Montana. That's right, above Montana, where some of America's nuclear weapons are stored, a Chinese Communist Party surveillance balloon was suddenly spotted. And the reason that we know that this is definitively a spy balloon from China is because shortly after it was spotted, the Pentagon came out and confirmed that fact. Here's specifically what Brigadier General Mr. Pat Ryder said just yesterday. Quote, "The United States government has detected and is tracking a high-altitude surveillance balloon that is over the continental United States right now. The U.S. government, to include NORAD, continues to track and monitor it closely. The balloon is currently traveling at an altitude well above commercial air traffic and does not present a military or physical threat to people on the ground." He then said in this continuously reassuring statement that this was not the first time that such a balloon was detected. Now, apparently, what happened was that this balloon originated in China, flew over top the Aleutian Islands of Alaska, then it went down through northwest Canada before finally arriving over top Montana. And according to the Brigadier General, the balloon not only has some sort of payload underneath the surveillance component, but also this particular balloon has the power to maneuver. Here's specifically what he said.
So again, this is a surveillance balloon, operating at about 60,000 feet. Clearly, we did a very close assessment in terms of what it's doing. And as I mentioned, military commanders have assessed that there is no physical or military threat to people on the ground. And so in that regard, we'll continue to monitor.
Again, that is just amazing. Whenever I personally do any reporting out in the field, I literally cannot fly my drone in certain parts of the country because drones, modern drones, have built-in technology which limits where they can and cannot fly based on FAA regulations. And I've known of people actually getting arrested for just flying drones in the wrong areas. And yet, here we have the Chinese Communist Party flying a maneuverable surveillance drone balloon with some sort of mysterious payload over the Pacific Ocean, over top Alaska, through Canada, over Montana, and now it's somewhere in the central part of the US. And actually, wait a minute, what happens when you zoom in on that balloon? Yeah, that's right, what a great reminder. You should indeed smash those like and subscribe buttons. Thank you, China. Now, the obvious question here, at least one of the obvious questions, is why don't we just shoot this thing down? Why don't we just blow it up to smithereens? Well, according to statements from the Pentagon, they claim to have considered that option, but they rejected it because they're worried that by shooting the balloon down, the resulting debris might injure someone or something on the ground. This, in fact, right here was the latest statement that was released from the Department of Defense. Quote, "We know the balloon has violated U.S. airspace and international law, which is unacceptable. We have conveyed this directly to the People's Republic of China at multiple levels. We assess the balloon does not present a military or physical threat to people on the ground. We will continue to monitor and review options." If a statement like that doesn't convey military strength, I don't know what does. Now, on the flip side, the Chinese Communist Party came out with their own statement saying essentially that this whole thing was an accident, that this was actually a civilian weather balloon doing some sort of meteorological research that had, quote, "deviated far from its planned course due to forces beyond its control." Basically, their argument is that this was a made-in-China balloon, and therefore, like most other made-in-China products, it just happened to malfunction. However, despite these denials from the Chinese Communist Party, many Americans, starting yesterday, began to rightfully wonder whether this was really just a dry run by the Chinese Communist Party to see how far they can get, to see whether they can indeed get such a balloon far enough into America, into mainland America, to set off something like an EMP attack. Now, in case you've never heard of it before, an EMP attack, otherwise known as an electromagnetic pulse attack, is one of the most deadly threats that's facing our country. The way that it works is that a nuclear weapon detonated in the stratosphere above the United States would completely cripple the entirety of our electrical grid and set us back 100 years in the blink of an eye. And this is not a new threat. In fact, back in the year 2001, the US government authorized the creation of something called the EMP Commission in order to study the threats that this would actually pose for the country. The committee then published a report, you can see it up on your screen, and they found that an EMP attack could result in the destruction of up to 70% of the US electrical grid and cause a nationwide blackout for over a year. And according to those experts, this blackout would lead ultimately to the deaths of tens of millions of Americans. And the reason for that is simple. Like it or not, we live in a time right now where almost everything we do requires some form of electricity. Every single industry that we rely on, depends on electricity to function. And so without electricity, businesses would shut down. Most people wouldn't be able to heat or cool their homes. Both gas as well as oil pipelines would shut down because those systems run on electricity. And when the oil stops flowing, well, that's a hard stop for the delivery trucks providing our food. Fresh water stops flowing into people's homes. The internet obviously goes down. Phone lines stop working. Nuclear reactors are suddenly unable to maintain their core temperatures and possibly melt down, and so on and so forth. There are thousands of problems that this country would face if the electrical system were to be suddenly destroyed. And you can imagine that it wouldn't take very long before society itself begins to break down, and the people begin resorting to any and all means to fight for both their own and their family's survival. Now, how many people right now in this country do you think are ready to survive a situation like that? How many people do you think have the necessary knowledge, the necessary skills, the necessary abilities, and the necessary resources to survive a situation where, in the blink of an eye, we are thrust back to pre-industrial times? Well, the researchers on that committee, they've looked deeply into this scenario, and they estimate that about only 10% of Americans have that capacity. Only 1 in 10 Americans, mostly located in rural areas far away from cities, would be able to take care of themselves. In fact, the government recently declassified a very important document, you can see it up on your screen, having to do with EMP attacks. And inside of that document was an exchange that took place in front of the Armed Services Committee, wherein Dr. William Graham, he's the chairman of the EMP Commission, he was testifying, and he presented a rather stark assessment of what America would look like following an EMP attack. Here's the transcript in its entirety. So at first, Congressman Roscoe Bartlett from Maryland asks this, quote, "I read a pre-publication copy of a book called 1 Second After. It was a story of a ballistic missile EMP attack on our country. The weapon was launched from a ship off our shore, and then the ship was sunk so that there were no fingerprints. The weapon was launched about 300 miles high over Nebraska, and it shut down our infrastructure countrywide. The story runs for a year. It is set in the hills of North Carolina. At the end of the year, 90% of our population is dead. There are 25,000 people only still alive in New York City. The communities in the hills of North Carolina are more lucky. Only 80% of their population is dead at the end of a year." Is this a realistic assessment of what a really robust EMP laydown could do to our country? To which Dr. Graham responds by saying this, quote, "We think that is in the correct range. We don't have experience with losing the infrastructure in a country with 300 million people, most of whom don't live in a way that provides for their own food and other needs. We can go back to an era where people did live like that. That would be 10%, would be 30 million. And that is probably the range where we could survive as a basically rural economy." Although whether at this point the remaining Americans would be able to fend off an invasion by the Chinese communists is a whole other question. However, since we're on the topic, let me give you a brief breakdown of how an EMP attack actually works in practice. All right, the sponsor of today's episode is a phenomenal company called AMAC. That's AMAC, and it stands for the Association of Mature American Citizens. They are quite literally one of the fastest growing conservative organizations in all of America, and you should consider joining for 3 main reasons. The first is the money-saving benefit, because as a member of AMAC, you get access to a ton of discounts at many different verticals. Things like vitamin stores, restaurants, retail shops, and so on and so forth. If you want to check out the full list, it's pretty exhaustive, you can do so over on AMAC's website. The second benefit is that you get exclusive access to the AMAC magazine. It'll be delivered directly to your doorstep, and it contains phenomenal coverage as well as deep analysis. And then the third benefit, the one that people say is their favorite, is that AMAC fights for your values over on Capitol Hill. In fact, you can check out the online version of this on their website. It's the AMAC Action Advocacy Annual Report, and it shows exactly what they're doing on Capitol Hill in terms of fighting what they call the socialist storm that's brewing in this country. So head on over to amac.us/factsmatter and sign up today. I'll also throw a link down in the description box below. However, since we're on the topic, let me give you a brief breakdown of how an EMP attack actually works in practice. At its essence, a high-altitude electromagnetic pulse is achieved when a nuclear warhead gets detonated anywhere between 20 to 250 miles above the surface of the Earth. This can be achieved by strapping the bomb to something like a satellite, to an intercontinental ballistic missile, or even perhaps to a balloon. The key is just to make sure that the nuke is high up enough in the air right over the target that you want to take out. Now, one thing that you should know about nukes is that besides the destructive fireball that we all usually see in movies, the one that destroys everything in its path, a side effect of a nuclear explosion is the release of an intense pulse of electromagnetic radiation that covers everything in the line of sight from the center point of the explosion. And so here's a map to give you an idea of what this would look like in practice over top of the United States. If a nuclear warhead was detonated at about 18 miles above the Earth's surface, it would generate an EMP that would cover several states. At 62 miles, it would cover several more states. At about 130 miles, it would cover almost the entire US. And at an altitude of about 250 miles, it would cover not only the entirety of the continental US, but also giant swaths of both Canada and Mexico. Now, what's interesting to note is that unlike a typical nuclear attack, an EMP attack doesn't really have the associated physical destruction. You're not going to have buildings toppled over and cars melted to the ground. But what you will experience are all of your electronic devices immediately stop working as the electromagnetic pulse waves completely overload and fry the circuits. Everything, such as elevators, cell phones, computers, electronic billboards, your electric stove, everything shuts down. Although at this point you might be asking the obvious question, which is, how do we know this? If an EMP attack has never been done, how do we know what it actually looks like? And that's a great question. The knowledge that we have about these EMP attacks dates back to the year 1962, when the US was conducting nuclear experiments off the coast of Hawaii. At that time, the US government had reason to worry that if the Soviet Union were to detonate a nuclear bomb in space, it could either damage or destroy our intercontinental missiles. And so the US government authorized and conducted something called Project Fishbowl, where they set up a series of high-altitude nuclear weapon tests to find out for themselves what would happen when a nuclear weapon detonates so far up into the sky. And one of those tests was called Starfish Prime. And it was during this Starfish Prime experiment that the US learned about the dangers of an EMP attack for the very first time. What happened was that a nuclear device was set off at an altitude of about 250 miles above Johnston Island over in the Pacific Ocean, which was high up enough into the air and far away enough from mainland Hawaii that the scientists thought that it was safe. But the experiment proved otherwise. That's because in Hawaii, which is about 900 miles away from the blast, you saw street lights beginning to fail, circuit breakers that were tripped, alarms that were triggered, and a communications relay that was damaged. Additionally, going in the opposite direction, several US satellites that were in orbit at the time were also damaged by the resulting EMP. And it was at that moment, right there during that experiment, that these nuclear scientists realized that an EMP blast was a danger. But the US was not alone in this testing. That's because starting in October of that same year, in 1962, the Russians also detonated several nuclear explosions, this time over Kazakhstan, in order to calculate the impact of an EMP blast on the electrical grid. They eventually wound up conducting 7 of these nuclear experiments, changing up the height of the blast as well as the payload of the bomb in order to assess the difference in damage when you change up those variables. Now, while the total result of those experiments are still partially classified, back in the year 1994, during the peace agreements between Russia and America, some of the findings were handed over to US scientists. And according to what the Russians revealed to the US scientists, and then what subsequently the US scientists revealed to me and you, the common plebes here in America, the EMP blast over Kazakhstan, they destroyed transformers, they destroyed generators, entire communication systems, they destroyed switchboards, and almost all electronic devices. And so, if you are an up-and-coming world power like China, and you're looking at the United States, which is a technologically superior country that you might not be able to win in a head-to-head match, well, what do? The answer is obvious. You destroy the very foundation of the infrastructure that makes your enemy superior. And by the way, that is not a speculation. For instance, there is a Chinese textbook published by the People's Liberation Army called The Third World War, Total Information Warfare. And as a part of their doctrine, or rather as a part of their curriculum, here's what the textbook reads, quote, "Therefore, China should focus on measures to counter computer viruses, nuclear electromagnetic pulse, and quickly achieve breakthroughs in those technologies in order to equip China without delay with equivalent deterrents that will enable it to stand up to the military powers in the information age and neutralize and check the deterrence of Western powers, including the United States." And this is not just an academic argument confined to the pages of a textbook. In fact, as recently as March of 2020, the Chinese Communist Party was openly threatening the use of EMP devices against American naval ships over in the South China Sea, meaning that this is a real threat that the Chinese Communist Party is very open to flexing about. And now today, while the biggest topic of discussion in America is whether transgender inmates should be allowed within female prisons, well, there's a Chinese balloon slowly making its way to the center of our country, and for some reason, the Pentagon just refuses to shoot it down. If you'd like to go deeper into this story and read more about either this balloon or the history of EMP devices, I'll throw several links down into the description box below this video for you to check out. And then lastly, I'd love to give a big shout out to Mr. Eric Schumacher, our awesome researcher who helped pull together all the research about the history and dangers of these EMP attacks. He's currently holed up in his bunker getting ready for doomsday. And if you'd like to be a little bit more ready for yourself, then you can check out the link that's down in the description box below for an awesome supplement called elderberry extract. It's loaded with antioxidants as well as vitamin C, and it's made right here in America, over in the state of Wisconsin, and you can stock up on it before any EMP attacks come out to knock out the electrical grid. And if you click on the link below and use promo code American10, you will get 10% your entire order, so give them a shot. And then until next time, I'm your host, Roman from the Epoch Times. Stay informed, and most importantly, stay free.